Hi guys, and welcome to the Taboo Podcast. I'm here with Rosemary Robinson, member of the Extinction Rebellion Lincolnshire supporters group. Rosemary, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Hi, yes, as Jordan says, I'm Rosemary. I joined Extinction Rebellion Lincolnshire. In fact, I was a founder member of Extinction Rebellion Lincolnshire. Last December, we had our first public meeting and got 85 people along to it, which was brilliant for Lincolnshire because it's quite conservative with a small c when it comes to being active about things like this. So yes, we started the rebellion. We started the supporters group last December. That was following the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's predictions that we had between 12 and 32 years in which time to turn things around with regard to carbon emissions and ecocide and really sort of save the planet, I suppose, and all life on it. So that's where I'm coming from.
Well, that's fantastic. If I may, Rosemary, I'd like to ask you a few questions about Extinction Rebellion itself to start off with. Why was the group formed, and sort of what are the aims and sort of mission of Extinction Rebellion?
Right, well, as I said, the IPCC report came out last October, just over a year ago, and that really galvanised people that really concerned about the planet and the future for our children and grandchildren to get on board and actually do something. Extinction Rebellion was formed by a small group of people in the UK who had researched for a long time about how we can get system change, societal change, within the existing system, and in order to reduce carbon emissions so that we, as I said, so that we had a future. Extinction Rebellion basically has three main demands of the government, and this is quite an important point really. We're not directing our protesting and actions against individuals in society, but just against, mainly or chiefly against the governments and big businesses. Because we feel that although individuals can make individual changes and which can contribute to sort of saving the planet, what we really need is the sort of big whole-scale decisions and changes that are needed at a government and national level and international level. So we have three demands of the government. The first is that they tell the truth about climate change. It's happening a bit better now, but until our April rebellion, there was hardly anything in the newspapers and press and telly about climate change, and certainly the government and the opposition and other main political parties didn't really seem to mention it. They were so involved with Brexit. So the main thing is firstly to tell the truth about climate change, exactly what the implications are if we do nothing or don't do enough. So that's really important. Secondly, that we want governments to act now. It's no good acting in 10 years, 20 years, 30 years' time. We need immediate action now to reduce carbon emissions to net zero. Extinction Rebellion have given us a target of reducing them to net zero by 2025. As you know, probably, Parliament agreed to declare a climate emergency last April or May. With the figure of 2050. Labour Party had just announced their own policies for reducing it by 2050. They've got some good plans for reducing it by 2030, but certainly they're not going to net zero by 2030. We say that's not soon enough. So that's the second one, is really to act now. We've got to act immediately to do things. Otherwise, we reach certain tipping points where climate change becomes irreversible, and that means catastrophic changes throughout the world in terms of climate and the impact that will have on both human life and plant and animal life. So those are the first two demands. The third demand is that the government creates a citizens' assembly. This is something that has been tried and tested in other parts of the world, in other situations, to involve ordinary people in coming up with solutions. As we know, at the moment, our Parliament is pretty useless and it's pretty dysfunctional, and it is not able to make decisions about anything. And so something really important like climate change, we feel we need to involve the whole population. Citizens' Assembly would involve selected people to be representative of the population, and they would be given the authority and the information and the support from the government and civil service to have a debate and a discussion about the best way forward and ways that we can all work together to reduce carbon emissions.
Well, you mentioned that you'd like the government to sort of act now in terms of the climate change problems. What sort of action can the government take to sort of help?
Well, immediately they could do things like stop all oil, gas and coal exploration in this country, and indeed the mining of these things. They've just opened just proposing to open a new coal mine in Cumbria, which totally goes against any commitment to reduce carbon in the atmosphere. They could do things like immediately stop any investment in fossil fuels and encourage the banks to also do the same. There's a huge amount of money invested in fossil fuels worldwide. I mean, it goes into trillions of dollars, and that is just supporting the extraction of fossil fuels, which exacerbate the problem we've got now. So we've really got to go to a carbon neutral economy, and so those are really big things that we want them to do. Also to invest hugely in things like energy conservation in the home. A lot of our carbon emissions come from the home. I think it's about 35% in this country. And then there's also transport, which is a huge reducer of carbon emissions, and to look in towards reducing use of private car and encouraging public transport. So there's a huge amount of things that we as individuals can't do, government can, and so we're asking them to do it, or forcing them, persuading them to do it.
Well, I think you've touched upon some of the issues already, but for those that sort of aren't as well informed as members of Extinction Rebellion, what sort of are the problems that we as a society are now facing with climate change?
Well, one of the things I would have to say is that it's not something that's happening in the future. It's actually happening now. Climate change is really affecting not only this country, but certainly other parts of the world. As we know, in Australia, there's been wildfires which have never been seen before at this particular time of the year and this particular intensity. We've seen flooding in different areas. Indeed, in this country, we've seen flooding, which again wasn't something that we would have anticipated happening a few years ago. But with climate change, planet heating up, it means that weather systems and weather patterns are changing. A big problem, I think, is the melting of the ice in the Arctic. They originally said that it might be several decades before all the ice was melted. Now they're bringing down those predictions to say, well, it could happen in the next few years. We might not have any ice in the Arctic. And that is a real big problem, not only because the ice actually melts into the water and raises the sea levels, but also if you haven't got snow and ice reflecting back the sun, you're actually heating up the earth even more. So it is a real big problem. In Lincolnshire, we've seen flood risk management plans for Lincolnshire, which have been produced by the Environment Agency and indeed are on the County Council's website, which show that at 2 degrees of global warming, which of course global warming is created by the carbon emissions and other greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, we could see at least about half of Lincolnshire go underwater within the next few decades. And so that has really serious implications for the people in this country and particularly this county. I estimated about 250,000 people need to be rehoused if this happens, and that's not including places like Grimsby and Hull, which I didn't look at because they weren't in Lincolnshire. So we're talking about a huge number of people in migration, even within this country. Worldwide, they reckon there's already 165 million people on the move because of the climate, because they go in from drought-ridden areas or flooded areas, or it's just become unbearable to live anymore because it's too hot. So, yes, there's loads of things happening all over the place which are a direct result of climate change.
Well, like I say, you sort of touched on fossil fuels earlier, but again, for those that aren't so aware of the issues we face, what are the main contributing factors to these problems?
Well, it's when you burn fossil fuels, whether it's gas, oil or coal, it produces carbon emissions, and they're one of the main greenhouse gases, along with methane, I have to say, which is a big contributor as well, and actually more serious than carbon, because it's that more, I can't say the word, carbon emissions are the main one, but there's also methane and other emissions, which mean that the heat doesn't get through the sun. The heat isn't reflected back. It goes through the atmosphere and then sort of contributes to sort of warming up the seas and warming up the earth in total. Yes.
So if I may, I'd like to move on to sort of your involvement with Extinction Rebellion, and just start by asking sort of, how are you involved? Have you been in protests, public rallies and speeches?
I've been quite keen on it because I actually was a Green Party activist for about 20 years, and I decided not to do that anymore for various reasons, one of which was that I felt we were getting nowhere with the current political system, first past the post, the funding of political parties, the way the media reacts to the main parties and not the small parties. It's very, very difficult to get a foothold in decision-making in government. So when I heard about Extinction Rebellion, that seemed to me a way forward. I felt that I couldn't get anywhere through the electoral system, but maybe through direct action and protests, we could actually make some changes. So that's why I joined Extinction Rebellion. As I said, we joined last December. And yes, I've been on the April Rebellion. I've also been on the October Rebellion. I've also protested on a street in Manchester and also a bridge in Leeds, plus numerous events and actions in Lincoln itself. So yes, I've done quite a bit. I have been arrested. I have been charged. I have been on trial already. I've got another trial coming in January. But yes, I've been... Well, I really feel that, I've only got my own voice and my own body to sort of make a difference, and so that's what I'm using, and that's why I'm doing it.
Well, out on these protests and rallies, I think the general perception is that Extinction Rebellion is full of a lot of young members, aged between, say, 18 and 30, who sort of are seeing this movement and want to get involved and bring these issues to the forefront. Is that the sort of what you have seen when you've been out on this protest? That generally it's been a much younger sort of demographic, and that
I suppose in a way young people obviously are the ones that are going to be most affected by climate change. As you can see, that I'm not quite a pensioner, but I'm nearly a pensioner, so in a way, I mean, I probably won't be here I certainly won't be here in 30 years time, so to a large extent it doesn't impact on me that greatly, or I hope it won't. But yes, young people are at the forefront of this, and they're going to bear the brunt of climate change. But as it happens, our group in Extinction Rebellion, Lincolnshire, we've got a very wide range of people that are interested, and I would say, if anything, we've got more older people over 40, than we have younger people, those are students or teenagers or what have you. So, although I do know there's a climate strike is quite active in Lincoln with the school children, but no, I would say there was a good age range, and also in terms of whether they're working class or middle class, or whether they're professional, or whether they're sort of white collar, blue collar workers. I would say there's a really good mix of people. Obviously, a lot of the people do come originally from the environmental side of things. People who were previously in the Green Party or Greenpeace, Friends of the Earth. They're obviously the ones that are immediately sort of aware of the problems and came to rebel. But I would say it covers everybody. I mean, it's quite interesting because Boris Johnson referred to us as uncooperative crusties, and we all took that on. We had people sort of wearing badges saying, I'm an uncooperative crusty. So I don't think it's true that we're all a bunch of layabout hippies. Neither do I think it's true that we're all white, middle-class, privileged people. I think it's a good range of people, and as time goes on, the range of people and diversity is increasing.
Well, what is it like overall being a member of Extinction Rebellion? I think the protest in London over the summer, there was a lot of sort of public outcry that, it's getting in my way, I can't get to work. Is the reaction that you've found generally quite positive or quite negative towards what you've been doing in these nationwide protests?
Well, I would say, first of all, as an individual, belonging to Extinction Rebellion gave me a lot of hope, because when I first heard about how serious the climate emergency was, it was like somebody giving me a kick in the guts. I felt paralysed with fear and what's going to happen, how can I help my grandchildren? And so it was fantastic, absolutely fantastic, finding that there were other people who felt exactly the same way as you. And going on a protest like the ones in London is just absolutely amazing. It is so wonderful that you've got everybody there. It's got the sole intention of saving the planet for future generations. And it's very awe-inspiring. And you do feel like you're one big family and that you're all working for the same ends. And that gives me a lot of hope and a lot of... and everybody else feels like that. If you talk to anybody who's been on one of these demonstrations, they will say exactly the same thing. It's given me hope that we can change things and that there are good in people and we could get some changes. The actual protests themselves are fantastic. They're not, well, the one thing I would say is they're all non-violent, so they're all peaceful. There is no way that we use aggression or violence or anything like that, and that really alters the way that we're presenting to other people and the way that people react to us. Yes, we do things that are disruptive to everyday life, and actually that is one of the reasons why we do it, because we're saying you can't have business as usual. We've got to change the way we do things now. And so we give people perhaps a little taste of what disruption would be like, but we're saying, well, this is as nothing compared with what will happen in 10 or 20 years' time if we do nothing now. So generally speaking, I mean, I was on Parliament Square in April, so we had a huge amount of tourists walking through, and we had lots of ordinary workers going to and fro. It was fabulous because it was totally traffic-free, totally noise-free. You could hear the birds singing. There was no pollution, no noise, and people could walk around without fear of having accidents or anything like that. One or two people, I mean, you know, people do... Obviously, I mean, I appreciate that people have got jobs to go to, they've got mortgages to pay, they've got kids to get to school and so forth. And so, yes, it's disruptive to them, but we're saying we're not trying to get at you, we're getting at the government, we're getting at the system. That's what needs to change. Unfortunately, in doing that, in highlighting these problems, it does mean that you have some temporary disruption, but we think it's worth it, and we hope that you will too.
Well, do many of the people that you get a chance to speak with on these protests that sort of aren't part of Extinction Rebellion, do they understand why you're there, and do they sort of have sort of sympathy for the problems? Do they, I think the people that don't understand, do they sort of have a sympathy for what you are trying to do despite the disruption? I
think so. Well, as I said, there was a marked difference between the rebellion in April in London and the rebellion in October in London. This time around, people were far more accepting and giving us a thumbs up or tooting their horns or coming to join us in marches or protests and actions. So I think, generally speaking, the tide is turning. People are realising that there is a really severe problem here, and that we as Extinction Rebellion, we may be doing things that sometimes they don't like, but we have achieved getting media interest, government interest, political party interest, which is what we need.
Well, you mentioned briefly sort of being arrested at these protests and the police presence. How has the police reaction been like to these protests? I mean, we've seen some images sort of in the mainstream media of people being carried off, and so how has that been in person, sort of seeing the police presence at these protests?
Well, I've never been arrested before, and I've certainly never been in London protesting like this before, and I have to say I found the Metropolitan Police brilliant. They were and I haven't met anybody else that was fed up with them or on a personal level. Each individual police officer has been absolutely fantastic. They've been very respectful and very kind and very helpful. They've not been rough or aggressive or anything like that, which in part I think is because that's the way we approach them. When they're trying to arrest us, we sing, we love you, we love you, we love your children too. And so it's obviously, if you're not giving aggression, then it's very difficult for people to respond with aggression. So I think that's been a really good tactic. But having said that, the police were very good, and I haven't any complaints with them. Did have a complaint with the way, the tactics of the police, particularly this time round, with impounding our vehicles and things that were in our vehicles, like a lot of our tents and marquees, tea urns, disabled ramps, and things for disabled people, which are all impounded, and we still haven't got them back now. So I think they took 80 tonnes of equipment, and a lot of that is been destroyed. I actually saw a huge pile of stuff on Horse Guards Road, which was where I was encamped, being put into a bin lorry at 1 o'clock in the morning and just crushed, and that included tables, chairs, wheelchair I saw on the top of a pile. So there were things that you think, well, that's not very good, and as we've now discovered, the police's imposition of this Section 14 of the Public Order Act in order to make us disperse and not assemble in London has been found unlawful by the Judicial Court. So we've now in the position that people who were arrested during the October Rebellion, or at least some of them, have now been in a position where they can sue for wrongful arrest and wrongful imprisonment. So I would say the tactics weren't so good, but the actual police officers themselves have been brilliant.
Well, we've seen a lot of reports in the mainstream media about the Extinction Rebellion protests, not entirely positive, and that may be down to the action of certain individuals. And sort of over the summer we saw some graffiti and some individuals trying to stop the tubes, I believe. Do the actions of some individuals, do you believe, sort of distract from the message that Extinction Rebellion is trying to get across?
Well, if I just go one step before then, Extinction Rebellion is a social movement. It's not an organisation. You don't have to be a member to join, and there's no way that you could be expelled from being a member if you're not a member. So it's a very non-hierarchical movement, and as long as an individual agrees with the three demands that we're making of the government, and as long as they agree with the values and principles of Extinction Rebellion, principally non-violent direct action, but also dignity and respect for other people, and making sure that what we do is in line with what Extinction Rebellion feels is the right way to go about things, then people are fairly autonomous. Groups can decide to do what they want. The Docklands Light Railway, or the tube station action that was in this last rebellion, that action was actually polled, or the Extinction Rebellion members who wanted to could say whether they agreed with that action or not. And as it turned out, 74% were against it and the others weren't. But because of our autonomous and non-hierarchical nature, that group decided to go ahead with that. One thing that, and I think a lot of people regretted that had happened, but as I said, we're not in the position of sort of saying, well, we're not going to let you come into Extinction Rebellion anymore, because that's not the way it works. But I would say that one of the things that wasn't highlighted, in fact I didn't see it in the press at all, over the tube station action, was that what the activists were trying to do was illustrate that within decades, if nothing is done, the whole of the tube system will go underwater. So talking about disruption, we were disrupting one train for 5 minutes, then the whole of the system in the underground could go underwater, and that will certainly disrupt the city. So the message we were trying to get across was unfortunately lost because people were unhappy with that particular action. And, I agree with them. I don't think that's necessarily the best way to go about it.
Well, what do you make of the general media coverage of Extinction Rebellion? Do you feel they sort of miss the target in some sense, and they're not able to get the message across that Extinction Rebellion is trying to say, or do they sort of look at the individual action as opposed to why these actions are happening?
It's a bit of both. I think if you look at certain press, certain Tory press, you'll find that they home in on the individuals and they slag them off and their personalities. They look into the background and they say, oh yes, this and this about this person. Whereas if you look to more reasonable press, particularly The Guardian, I think is very good on this. And now it's starting that the BBC are getting a bit more rounded in their presentation of Extinction Rebellion and our actions. And a lot more reasonable and balanced. But it takes time, we're a very new very new movement. We've only been going for just over a year, so yeah.
Do you feel like, because obviously some media organisations pinpoint down on the individual action, however, in doing so, they are still publicising the Extinction Rebellion movement as a whole. So yeah. I'd just like to sort of ask your opinion on, do you feel like there is such thing as bad publicity when it comes to the group Extinction Rebellion?
That's an interesting one, isn't it? Because way back, I can't remember when it was now, probably in January or February, we Extinction Rebellion Lincolnshire members graffitied Barclays Bank in Lincoln. And there was a huge outcry. Now, there was a very good reason for this being done because, as I said, they invest billions, if not trillions, in fossil fuels, and with the dirty Bank of Europe, they're called. And so we were trying to sort of illustrate to people that this is what was happening, and do you really want to bank with this bank? If you move your business elsewhere, it will force them to take actions to reduce their fossil fuel investments. So we had a very good reason for doing it. And it certainly caused a lot of publicity. We immediately got on the television, we immediately got on both the radios, and we also had a lot of press in the local newspapers. So, yes, I would say all publicity is good publicity, but it's a fine line. It is a fine line.
And I think the final question really I have to ask is, do you feel like the sort of notorious faces of the Extinction Rebellion movement, like Greta Thunberg and Chris Packham from Lincolnshire, do you feel like them supporting the movement has sort of helped it grow and helped spread the message?
Yeah, I think one of the fantastic things that happened in April, we had the Extinction Rebellion, April Rebellion in London, and that happened at the same time as Greta came over to talk to our Parliament, and also at the same time that David Attenborough produced his programme on climate change. So I think those three things coming together definitely had a huge impact. And we're now getting more and more people, celebrities or people from broadcasting, writers, artists, musicians, they're all coming now to support Extinction Rebellion. And I think that is good because people respect certain people. I mean, people do respect Chris Packham. People do respect Greta Thunberg. People do respect David Attenborough. And so I think that's been a really helpful in raising awareness.
Okay, I think that's just about all the questions that we have to ask you today. Rosemary, I'd like to thank you for coming down and speaking with us today.
Okay, thank you.
And that's it for the first instalment of the Taboo Podcast. Check in next time where we'll be speaking with Mohit Bulkandani, VP International at the University of Lincoln Students' Union, about how the university deals with issues of racism and aims to include all members of different backgrounds and cultures at the university. Thank you for listening. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.